Hi, welcome to this video all about your doctoral study. Here are some tips as you begin to work through the process and begin to write. Begin to think about your topic, begin to think about the entire process as a whole. Maybe feel a little bit less overwhelmed because it is easy to feel overwhelmed when you're about to embark on something that's so significant. The first thing is to keep in mind that you are in an organizational leadership program. So everything that you conduct and you study and you work on needs to be related to organizational development. You may absolutely love the concept, for example, of gardening. That's fantastic, but it's not organizational leadership. So how can you study an org leadership issue in that particular topic? Maybe a group of small businesses that run gardening companies have an organizational leadership problem. One of the other components to this is that you need to make sure there's scholarly literature to back up what it is you are trying to uncover. So for example, I see all kinds of problems out in the real world, and no doubt you do as well. But that doesn't mean that they're all worthy of doctoral study. There needs to be some literature supporting that it's worthy of a study. You can contact the librarian for help trying to find articles that will support that component of your work. Another major element is that you need to have a testable research question. If you are choosing quantitative or qualitative will be dependent upon this research question. So as you look at 50 different elements of maybe a problem that you identify in human resources or a problem that you identify in leadership in general or Gen Z businesses, something of interest to you so that you feel compelled to want to study it, as you identify this, you need to make sure that it's testable. So what does that mean? Well, let's say you see a problem in human resources, but you don't know anything about human resources. It may not be something that you can therefore write from a theoretical and practical perspective with any integrity about. So you do need to know something about the topic so that you're able to write clearly and understand the problem. And this is why I think it's so important that you have a very good understanding and interest in the topic in general. I've had research students work on studies about minority entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs out of the country, but they have access to those individuals or they know someone who does. So you have to make sure that it's testable. If you think about the problem and you're really stumped at, I don't know how I'm going to actually reach these people to ask them questions or get them to do a survey, or I don't know enough about the actual topic to be able to articulate what I'm trying to say, or someone in the field is not going to really think that my study is of value, you should probably consider a new topic. Doesn't mean you have to go off of that line of thinking altogether, but think of a new way to approach the problem. One of the best ways to do this from my experience, and I've been working with doctoral students for 20 plus years, and one of the best ways to do this is to read existing literature. When you read existing literature, you will find an area for future study in most studies. The areas for future study, which you'll include in your study as well, is a framework for the next researcher to bounce off of. So what you do is you identify if that problem has been solved from there. That maybe if you're really struggling to find a topic for study, that's a really good place to start. Where did the last researcher on this topic leave off? And maybe you can fill the void from there. If you get stuck, that's another option. Regardless, you do have to have a literature review section, which means this topic needs to be wide enough that you can get 20, 30 pages of literature review topic. However, not so much so that it's already been studied ad nauseum and it's just another study on just exactly the same problem. So you need something that's unique. Think something niche. One thing I tell my students, you do not need to solve world hunger with your doctoral study. You need to solve, if your topic is like this, you need to solve something like this. You need to solve a very specific and very narrow problem. If your question is whether or not IT professionals really work more than 40 hours in a week, for example, because that's related to organizational leadership and you've been able to clearly make that distinction. That's one example of maybe you're thinking about that from a broad perspective. Now we get very focused. In the IT space, in private companies, under 10 million, in a specific region. You get very narrow and focused. Now, you might be thinking, well, I want to talk about how that relates to the overall population. That's where transferability comes in. That's where you talk about things like, what is it that I can do? How can I show that my study is transferable? And to what degree does it have limitations? Because every study I've conducted is not transferable to the larger population. It's not. It is, and my students as well, it is transferable to a specific subsegment. And sometimes it's really not transferable at all because the demographic is not the same. If you're studying 100 males, but the population is 50% female and 50% male, you do not have a transferable study. So those are the sorts of things that you'll document in the assumptions and limitations component of your study. Without getting too far in the weeds, I just want to mention a few other tips. Make sure that your study is one in which you can have alignment. So as you proceed and you're trying to identify the methodology will be driven by the research question. So you may hate math, hate it. I get it. I teach statistics. Some of my students do not like it. That does not matter. If your research question is written in such a way that the best outcome will be dictated by a quantitative study, it's time to brush up on your statistics. If you are not an interviewer, you're an introvert like me, and you do not like to interview people, you are not going to be able, if your research question is written in such a way that the best opportunity for consistent, reliable, accurate results is going to be to interview and use methodology or use some case study or rounded theory or phenomenological study. I always twist that one up. If that's the case for you, you are going to have to learn how to do that. So your research methodology is not driven by what you like. It's not driven by what will get you done faster, and it's not driven by what you're comfortable with. It is driven by your research question. How will you best address that research question? You might be thinking, well, I'll just change my question so that it's more aligned with what I'm comfortable with. That's as long as it's still a valid, reliable question, a genuine question that isn't sometimes as they get twisted up and not stated properly anymore. As long as it's the same, you're essentially getting at the same thing, you can do that. But I don't advise it. My advice to you as students working on this process is to learn the methodology that's most appropriate for your research question. And finally, the alignment piece that I alluded to. It's really important that throughout your study, if you have the purpose of the study, A, being A, and you have the research question being maybe A squared or B, oftentimes, that's not in alignment. So if your research question is, do IT workers put in a full-time amount of work, a full-time workload, right, in their careers? Your hypothesis can't be something like engineering doesn't work enough hours, right? That's not aligned. Your hypothesis in the quant study would be, my null hypothesis is IT workers are working less than 40 hours. So you can see how the hypotheses are very clearly aligned with the research question. They must also be aligned with the problem statement. They must also be aligned with the methodology that you've chosen, with the purpose of the study. So alignment section by section is crucial. One of my personal tips to being successful doing this is to outline every component first and then go back and fill in the blanks. I have found that works well for my students as well. If you do a quantitative study, regardless of what type of study you conduct, you must get a high enough sample that you can say that there's some reliability and some validity. So reliability is if I conducted the study again, I'm going to get the same results, most likely. Validity is I studied what I thought I actually studied and not something else. So you need both in your study, and you'll be addressing both in your research. If you're doing quantitative methods, if you're using quantitative methodology, then you need to make sure that you use G-Power, which is freely available online, to determine your sample size. And you're not always going to get that sample, but you have to show that you did your absolute best to get there. Sometimes you can get participants through systems like SurveyMonkey, for example. That can really help students get there. There are different types. You'll learn about snowball samples, about convenience samples, and so on, that might be of use to you. You cannot use your own instrument. And this, I can't impress upon this to you enough. You cannot write your own survey. It needs to be something that's already validated through existing studies, and you need permission to use it. And you might say, well, I can write research, I can write study questions. The amount of time it will take you to validate, pre-test, post-test is so long, it's not within the scope of the study. So make sure that if you are using quantitative methods, that you find an existing study that you can use. Contact the owner of that study, the researchers of the study, and get permission to use it in yours. Most of the time, researchers are very happy to share that type of knowledge and information. If you have any questions, make sure you reach out to your instructor. Make sure you use all of the resources that you have available to you. Make sure that you are finding that gap in literature, make sure that you have a testable study, make sure you have alignment, and make sure you have a methodology that is properly conducted or properly chosen based on your research question.